Well, welcome you again.
It's great to be here. I'm going to give you a talk. I saw the presentations that you're being given before I did mine, so I got to trying to fill a gap in the middle and I'll explain what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to give you three things in the next 15 minutes. Just a small bit of context on behavioural insights in UK tax administration. I'm going to give you some examples around digital and online tax services, and what I'm hoping that is for the tax audience, those are really relevant, but for anyone in the public or private sector who have digital services, online services, those examples will give you something to think about. It's an area I'm passionate about in terms of matching experimentation, data, behavioural sciences, and how we developed online services. And the third one, I'm going to try and put that in the wider context and bring it back to some of the things Eric's been talking about, and to try and give you some sort of real examples where behavioural economics, behavioural science crashes into tax administration, and there's some real choices and some really big things to work on. So, just a very brief background. So, I have to thank Michael here. So Michael came on secondment into HMRC, which is the UK's tax department. Francesca, who works with Michael, also been working there, and they did incredible work on debt. And what our department said was, we need our own team, our own capability to do that. So in 2012, a very small team was set up of 2 people. I was recruited over from doing automatic enrolment into pensions, and we're now about 15 people, and we do about 40 projects at any one time, and those change regularly. We have about 10 trials at any one time as well. People in the team, there's a few here today, but it's a really mixed background. So everything from people from natural sciences, biology, economics, psychology, branding consultancy, marketing consultancy, big data, everything you can think of is probably in there somewhere. So what are the things we're doing at the moment? Well, we carry on doing work on debt, and we've got some fabulous results. I'm not going to talk about them today, but we've redesigned whole customer journeys. And in much the way Cheryl Lee was just talking about in Australia, we're doing similar things here. And at some point we'll talk about those results. You could probably, if you pick them out, there's some really good stuff if you blow it up when you go into the slides. We also do work on penalties and incentives. So some of the things that Eric talked about, how do you do penalties in a way that makes sense? What does behavioural economics bring to penalties? And what are the real basics? A lot of people in tax systems behave like penalties don't exist. So if you remind them, you see massive changes in behaviour. Behavioural tax administration, I'll talk a little bit about today. There's a huge amount of projects we're doing in that area, and I'm going to start with digital service optimisation. So why do I think digital services are important, not just to tax administration, but also public services and other things? Well, they're massive parts of how governments deliver for citizens. And one of the keys there is how to improve the citizens' experience of government. And they can also, in our world, help customers to comply. That's a really key thing. If you're, and we're doing this all the time as governments, we need to think about it. The second thing is, actually, it's a massive opportunity. Digital services, in general, are a lot easier to work in, to change things, to understand what works, and to bring behavioural sciences into that. And the third thing is, this is an area where behavioural science is being forced to meld with other disciplines, user experience, design and data sciences. That's what's really exciting about it for me. And there's a sort of fourth element, which is it's cross-country. You'll be surprised. Internationally, it's not a developed and a developing thing. Quite often, developing countries have better digital services than the developed. And you'll see it in the private sector as well. New companies have much better data and digital services than old companies who have data warehouses all over this place. So I just want to put you in a position. So you've earned £5,000 worth of tips this year, going back to the previous example, or you're all great behavioural scientists, you've earned £5,000 consulting while you're in London. So just put yourself in a position. Let's assume you're in the UK. This is all hypothetical. We want you to have a digital tax account. We want you to have somewhere where all your information is, and you can get information, and then you can go in over the year, look at that, and then maybe do your tax return at the end of it. In January in the UK is a big data. So just put yourself in that sort of thought. And we're just going to go through some like very basic trials to try and do some of that better. So just a quick reminder, randomized control trials, basically comparing things against each other in live streams, also called A/B testing and multivariate testing. I use whatever my clients, we run as a consultancy essentially, I all use whatever my client's language is inside the department and outside This is one of the tests I'm going to talk to you about. We started with a simple test between two screens, which are all about getting people, they're already doing their tax returns online, but they still get letters. And the HMRC is the biggest sender of letters in the UK. We chop down forests every year for our letters. So for our costs, but also the customer, is a really important thing to change that. And also the forests probably could do with a break as well. So let's try and do something about it. So you've got a variant here that basically you have to put in your email address. We really need that information because some of our data is not as clean as it might be on that, so we need that. And we also want you to make an active choice. So this version of the form was user tested a lot. This came through UX and things. And there's one feature of it that we looked at and went, they got up to a certain level of take-up and said, what can we do to increase it? So we wanted to do something, and what we did was we just pre-filled the radio button, like the boxes. Now what we didn't do is they still need to make an active choice. They still need to fill in their email address twice. So it's a minor thing, but you get 5 percentage points just from that. It's just good form design. I know it's not amazing stuff, but when you take that, that's a huge thing for our world. It's a massive thing because when I give you the figures for how many people that delivers into a paperless service, that changes. That's probably over time millions and millions of pounds that can be used on other things to help tax administration. So then we did another test, as you do. So 3 more versions. The first thing we did was added a reference to the norm that thousands of people had already chosen this, so you'd imagine. We added the norm reference and a reference to paperless. It's quite interesting, some of the literature, the word paperless in the English language sometimes gets people to do more, might do. The third one, we did all of that, and we told them they were getting the service first, which they were for this particular one, that opportunity, get in there. So the numbers are is 1, 2, 3, and that represents the ones you can see there. I'm telling you, at least one of those was better than the version B. So if we vote now, please have a vote. It was C and D. And interestingly, on C and D as well, the dropout from that page went down significantly as well, which is a really good thing. You don't want to see people dropping out of your pages. If any of you work with conversion funnels, it's a bad thing that if people go, why am I here? I just want to go and do something else. I don't want to do what you're asking me to. So there's some good stuff there. This contributed to over 1.2 million paperless sign-ups. And as you can see, we've made a really big difference to how many people signed up for this. The other thing you might see is test 1 over trial 1 on the left and trial 2 on the right. The success of B goes up, doesn't it? You've got seasonality in that data over time, and there's good reason to think in this case that it's about the people that are coming in and why they might or might not take up services. But this is a really big thing. And it throws up challenges for randomized control trials, but also if you're running digital services and you have dashboards, some of you will have dashboards and you will look at them. If you just don't do randomized control trials A/B testing, you can easily mistake changing something for an improvement, and actually what you're seeing is seasonality of data. The other things that you try and see in this data, there's quite a lot. It's amazing what you find. Page load times. There was just something going on in the code that we could pick up in both tests that no one had noticed, and you can just, if you've got millions of people seeing these screens, it's just useful to make improvements. So now they're all in the paperless service, it's great. We now want them to look at the things that are going into their secure account. We send them an email to say you should look at what's going on in your account. So let's try and optimize the emails they get to get them to go into their account. So we're going to send them something that tells them about when they need to file. And what they will do is get the email alert, and we hope they log in. I'm just going to share the opening rates of the emails, but what we see here is reflected in what we see in the back-end sign into the secure account. The trial design 2x2 is basically the things we changed were the subject line. In one of those, it's just a very factual 2014 to 2015 self-assessment deadlines. The other version was you can now file your self-assessment tax return. That, for a lot of reasons, trying to get more action quicker is something we will look at. And the body of the text, actually, there was a long body which told them a bit more about what they needed to do, and there was a short body that just really gave them the basics. So again, this went to 1 million people. So this is 1 million sample for variants, so you've got quite good power in here. So these are some of the results, just from where we are at the moment. So what you can see here is that the subject header does make quite a, I thought about, you can rank these basically, so don't worry too much about it. All of them can be ranked statistically significant. The sort of active subject line, you get lower opening rates. I should say these opening rates are really, really high. Like, I don't know about your businesses, but if I'm getting, that's really high opening rates. So these are the opening rates of the emails. So the active subject line seems to mean people actually open the email less and you get less flow through into things. And the body of the text also makes a difference. This is interesting. It helps us optimize. This is a million people we're doing with. The really interesting thing is we can then follow these people through. We're doing a lot more testing and eventually we find out how many of them comply. And this is where the data science crashes into where we are, that you can take that group and follow them through. Does whether they open the email make a difference in whether they eventually file on time and declare accurately their income in January? We will find out in February, hopefully. But the other big things here is these are good, strong interim outcomes. Also, it just gives you simple things. So for this group, Tuesdays, early evening, sending the emails is significant and quite a big effect size better than other options, which is a really important bit of learning if you're trying to deal with a group. These are probably, as I described, they're people who are small traders, consultants maybe, people with complex tax affairs, so it might not work. Just a quick final example. This was about giving them access to help and support. My main message here is simplification works. If you're going to do one thing, forget the behavioural messages. So doubling, these are click-throughs, not opening rates, and those are really big click-through numbers. So that was with business populations. But here's a great result. We used some social norms, threw a social norm in there. None of these are at the bottom are statistically significant, didn't work. That's why you need to test. Well, I'm an empiricalist, so I just sort of like testing, but it's right to do that. Don't assume what we don't know. So throwing that into the wider context for the final couple of minutes, the UK is going on a journey that Norway and other countries are already on, which is about using data to get around some behavioural challenges and to help people. So one of the big things that you find in tax, taking it back to the behavioural economics, is you see a lot of mental accounting issues and actual accounting issues. 50% of small businesses don't put anything by for tax. So you've actually got actual accounting issues as well as mental accounting issues. The mental accounting issues is, I think about my income as all mine, and it's not the tax man's. There's not a bit of it that's the tax bit. You can also explain this in terms of reference points and prospect theory if you want to, but it's quite a big thing. So what might you do? Well, you make it easier to return with new digital services. You give near real-time feedback. You have near real-time reporting of income if you can help people. So there's lots of applications now that we don't necessarily set up, but you can help you get that information in your tips or your consulting money or your expenses in real time. So there's some things there, and this is part of something bigger, and what we like to do here is learn. Pre-populating data is a really classic example of where the behavioural science crashes in, and Nina Azar, I think, is here today and has done some related work here, which we're sort of crashing into the field. Let's think about it. That £5,000 is pre-populated in your tax return when you go in January. Think about that, and also think about what if we get it wrong for some reason, we didn't pick it up right and it's 2,500. Well, depending on that, the defaults is quite powerful. If you get it right, that's a really good thing, because you're also getting people to, it's very hard for people to move away from it. And it gives you good authority and fairness, because you're doing them a good service. But let's think about that if we get it half of it. What might that do if we get the figure wrong? Well, you're defaulting someone to the wrong amount, you're anchoring them potentially there. It might undermine your authority and fairness, because if they don't know that properly, what else don't they know about me? And it has some issues around fairness potentially. So this is where experimental impact evaluation, i.e. holding small numbers of people back to see what happens, is a really good idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit, well, I'm not going to talk about this, but what I would say, I've talked a lot here about how the data moves into this world. And what I'll break this down is we don't want to be dealing with whole populations, really. We as a discipline quite often push 5% of people from a general population one way or another. We need to understand what works for who or whom. And that's sort of a big area for that. So leaving you with 3-4 reflections. Behavioural tax administration is a key concept. So the big picture and the behavioural economics is really important. But don't forget to optimise all parts of the service, because that's really good for the customer, it's really good for public sector or private sector. Experimental techniques are valuable. There are some data challenges, particularly in older organisations, which is why developing countries have some thing. And the UK learns as part of a community with other governments. Norway's way ahead of us on some of this, and academics as well. And behavioural insights is a multidisciplinary field. This is where it all crashes together into something that works.
Is the mic on? Yes, it is. Mireille Etier, I'm Canada Revenue Agency. I'm the head of the Innovation Lab at the Canada Revenue Agency, which does both behavioral economics and tries to apply data mining to a lot of these concepts. So thank you very much for this presentation. It's really very close to kinds of things we do. And I agree with you that we're about service in tax administration, which means getting the money, but it also means making it easy for taxpayers to comply. And we try to make it easy for them and cheap for us, which is the other part of this. So that's why we're also trying to push a lot of people to e-filing, e-payment, e-deposits, and all kinds of things like that. I don't know what it does to compliance, but I think that's a separate question that we won't discuss today. I'm curious about one thing. We've been able to push about 85% of our individual tax payers to e-filing. The frontier seems, and we're looking into what the rest of the population is using various data mining things and then trying, BE or other things, or maybe we can't push any higher. Maybe that's the limit and we stay there. But where we really have a challenge, and I was wondering if that's the same thing here, is when you get to e-payment or e-deposit, it seems that people don't want to share their banking information with the tax authorities. So we really have a big challenge there. And we've tried some kind of nudge and other experiments and things like that, but it seems to be a much more difficult nut to crack. So I just wanted to have your views on this.
So very quickly, 15%, 85% ceiling. Doesn't seem out of kilter with research on assisted digital in the UK.
Yeah.
It's not, and in a business where we're public service and we can actually lose some customers, I think, we're pushing the upper limits there. In terms of, I agree with you on payments, and I think this is why you see, I don't know what it's like outside the UK, I've travelled quite a lot, but I've never seen this before, but in local government, you see in the UK, you see payment mechanisms being heavily incentivised using behavioural economics. You will see lotteries to get people on direct debits, and that's the reason. Because, to be honest, in terms of, there will be things you can do in there, but in applying some hard incentives and using behavioural economics is the next step. But then it has some real costs, and obviously how those costs are divided and how salient those costs are to the customer, that it costs a lot more to do things through certain things, are those steps. So it is a hard area, and I think that's why you see back in the paper world, direct debit, you see it such heavily incentivized for it is because it is that tricky challenge. So that's my sort of view on that as an overview. There's a lot more we could go into maybe separately outside.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. And by the way, I think the state of New York forces everybody to e-file.
And mandation's an interesting issue, not one where we are in the UK, but in many ways, but it's interesting.
Yes.
So first of all, thanks a lot for a great presentation. I was wondering, because the 2.1 seconds you spend on we need to know what works for whom, are you implying that you're trying to push different buttons, like the 6 types of influence that Chialdini coined? We also know that for some people it works better than for others, but are you allowed to really personalize the communication from the government to your citizens? Do you see any?
That is a very good point. And Michael was chairing me doing this exact same thing on Tuesday. Oh, well, not the same thing, and threw that question at me. Yeah, it's a big area on ethics. I'd look at this way. In digital services where you have a lot of people, you can't help but sample a lot of people. Your constraint is actually how many different treatments you can create. You're always oversampling, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing lots of subgroup analysis to understand what might work better for some people. And Michael's done some excellent work on this in debt. I'm not sure if he's published it yet, nod or shake. Yes, he has. So there's some interesting effects. That comes to the question of whether it's ethical. If you know that age and gender are good determinants of what behavioural levers try, or even if you've picked up something on pre-population, it just works really different when you put... That is the big ethical question. When I was sitting there and my ultimate boss, I guess, Jeremy Hayward, was talking about this yesterday, I got an email saying, we need a paper on ethics of trials, and someone else, the data science director, needs to do a paper on the ethics of predictive analytics and what it's fair to do. So you picked on the issue du jour, I think, and thank you for the question. I'd love to talk about it afterwards.
Excellent.
I think it's fair though, so please go ahead.
Oh, it's fair. Okay, that's it. I will write that. I just need your reference on that, and I will tell everyone. Absolutely. I think it's a really big issue. I think it's about fairness to customers ultimately and whether people accept it. And my view on behavioural insights is it should operate in full camera. It should work. It isn't about if you tell people what you're doing, it doesn't work. I'm more on the transparency side. That's where I sit. And I literally sit.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you. Okay, we have our last speaker now. It's Arne Christian Aas. He's senior analyst at Tax Norway, a country that has a lot of trust. His current work focuses on how to make self-employed individuals as well as businesses file on time with as mild an intervention as possible. His approach is very practical, but as we will see, it also has and yields theoretical insights. Arne.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about timing. And I'm going to talk about a project we've done where we did 56 randomized controlled trials. And a lot of those trials are about timing. We've had one goal, and that is to answer the question, how can we make more self-employed and businesses file? And the on time is kind of within parentheses, because we are also interested in having people self-assess after the deadline if they haven't filed by the deadline. We have more than 100,000 recipients, and it's not only because we're really bad at power sampling, it's also because we have large groups, and in many cases we just want results, so we hold back like a reference group, and then we intervene with the rest. So right now we're talking on the phone, or we have a phone campaign where we talk to 26,000 people, and we're just held back a reference group so that we can really tell whether or not it works. And we're really interested in the subgroups as well. We do this in pretty large scale, and the reason we do it is that if we do several interventions at the same time, we can tell them apart. And that makes a huge difference when it comes to figuring out which are the confounding factors and which are the most important findings. We can know for sure what is happening here. We started out in 2012. In 2012, we only did descriptive analyses, figuring out who are late. And by asking the question, so who are late, we have also found out what do we know about who are late and where do we need more knowledge. In 2013, we started testing, rather small scale. And so we've been doing more and more testing, larger and larger scale. And the main finding is that timing is crucial. We have a huge dividing line, and that is the deadline. So we've been doing testing before the deadline. We started out doing that because our main goal was to get people to file on time. Then the next year, we focused more on having people file, just having people file. So the first thing I want to share with you is on timing, and we sent the same letter to self-employed 1 week before the deadline and 3 weeks before the deadline. And what we found is that sending a letter, a reminder 3 weeks before the deadline, that was perfect. But doing it 1 week before the deadline didn't give the people enough time to actually fill in the tax forms. So it turns out that the process of filing takes some time. This is to a subgroup of recipients. Those are self-employed who filed late the year before, but they ended up filing at the end. And this is now implemented, and it works rather well. So the next thing I want to share with you are some findings on text messages. But first, I want you to vote. And the question is, what is the percentage increase in people filing after receiving a gentle reminder of the deadline? And that is by text message before the deadline. So please vote now. Kind of like expected, there's a tendency of gathering towards the middle, but also more than 10%, because you do know that nudging works. So you do have a belief that this is going to work. My guess is that about 7% are Norwegians who have already seen the presentation. because we did this pretty large scale. Honestly, we first did it only to 6 different subgroups. I'm not expecting you to read all of that, but those are the different subgroups we tried the text messages for. And that's all before the deadline. And we got one result, and no one believed it, and that was 0%. And the 0% more people or self-employed filing on time means do not do it. Do not send text messages before the deadline because it just doesn't work. And after having done this to 6 different groups over 1 year, no one believed us. They think, but we receive text messages all the time. We should do it. It should work. So we did it to 4 other groups, and same result. Just doesn't work. So I do hope that someone has actually tested it, because I receive those every single week, at least one reminder of something. So, but here we're back to the confounding factors. Because for each of those tests, we also sent letters, like physical letters by mail. So for each of those 10 tests, we also sent letters, and for the most part, they worked. But being before the deadline, they didn't really work that well. From 0 to up to, I think, 14%. But we did know for sure that text, it didn't have anything to do about the group. It had to do about the text messages not being the medium that we could use to make people actually file. So then we tried the same thing after the deadline, and luckily it works for some people, some groups. It doesn't work for businesses. When we send it to the head of the business, it just didn't make more people file. But after the deadline, it does work for self-employed and for VAT bi-monthly. It also has a pretty large effect, and text messages being cheap, this is one of the things we recommended doing. And this is one of the more complex graphs. I've been really not looking forward to trying to explain this to you, but the day 0 is the deadline. So the population here are the people who have not filed by the deadline. So 1.0 means that those are all in the population. And these are 5 different trials, randomized controlled trials that we've done. So it's a physical letter. It's a letter with a post-it note. The Irish IRS has, Irish tax agency has done that with a great success. Electronic mail, we have an electronic mailbox. We tried sending the same letter electronically. And there's a text message. And the upper line, where less people file, that's a reference group. So what can this graph tell us? First, the first 7 days after the deadline, people keep filing. So we shouldn't really intervene. You can tell really clearly that a lot of people are late, and it's kind of human to be late. And adding interventions at that time is really not a good idea. And then you also have the data question that it's not all data are up to date right away, and doing interventions also takes some time. So the first 7 days are hands-off time, and then the whole curve flattens out. So after those first 7 days, we intervened, and we waited longer than we had to. We waited almost 3 weeks, about 18 days. And you can tell here right away that the reference group keeps being rather high, but all the other groups, people start filing right away. And you can't really tell them apart. And if I'd added the confidence intervals, you really couldn't tell them apart, because at this point, they're almost all the same. And then people keep filing until about day 30. Around day 30, there is some businesses and self-employed have an extended deadline. So you can see all the lines bump. And then you have the summer holidays. And no one wants to do filing during the summer holidays, or no one. You see that there are some people filing. However, mid-July every year we have a media campaign. So for all the groups, those should be affected by the media campaign. However, there's absolutely no evidence for any of the groups filing more as a result of that media campaign. So this year we changed it, and hopefully it improves. And then, being a legal agency, there are some things we just have to do. So before we can assess, and the process of assessment is that if you don't file anything, we basically file it for you. And that's a pretty large and costly process, and before we could do that, we had to send a strict letter of assessment. And then you can tell that all those groups start really reacting. And you can also tell that the groups that didn't react initially, they react then. So the orange line there, and the one that's further to the top, that's text message, it really doesn't, it does a catch up here. So towards the end, by day 80, they're all the same. So it's really interesting that you can, by what you did, what we did initially, it keeps, the positive effect keeps going. So even if we measure after we send another intervention, it really works. So the next thing I want to share with you is another example on when to measure. And this is something we did for VAT bi-monthly. And here you can tell what we've learned. So instead of the first few days after the deadline, 7 to 8 days, it's hands-off time. So we kept our hands off. But then right away after that time, we started intervening with a letter. And that's like, 9 out of 10 have filed on time. Why haven't you done that? And that pretty mild letter seems to be working pretty well until day 30, 35, when the reference group, being the one on top, they receive a strict letter of assessment. And that's a stricter letter. And it's sent at a later time. And if you measure here, by day 40, you get the opposite result. So basically, the strict letter, in the end, seems to have more people file. So these are just a few examples of some of the RCTs we've done. And one of our main findings is that before the deadline, there are large volumes. So that means that accessing everyone will be really, or intervening with a lot of people will be quite expensive. And also, it has a cost when it comes to trust. Because one finding is that when we talk to people who have received letters from us, they tell us how afraid they get. And the first few moments when we talk to them, they're like, so in terms of building trust, it's not a good idea to target them before the deadline. And also 9 out of 10 will file without any interventions whatsoever. So in order to make that be effective, we really need to target specific subgroups. And for our purpose, for making more self-employed and businesses file on time, text messages, they just don't work. After the deadline, after the deadline, however, the volumes are a lot more manageable. There's only 1 in 10 left. 1 in 10 is still quite a few. But the thing is, we can easier personalize the message because the implicit message when we access people after the deadline or when we intervene with people after the deadline is that we see you. Even if we're really nice, have you forgotten the deadline? Or have you forgotten us? The implicit message is that we see you. You've done something wrong, and we're ready to react, but we do it in a nice way. And almost all the tests of what we do after the deadline yields positive results, but the cost-benefit really varies. So, and that's why we recommend the text messages, not before the deadline, because it doesn't work then, but after the deadline, it actually works. So timing is crucial, and before the deadline, it's a lot more difficult to yield effective results than after the deadline. So those are some insights. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious about something. You talk about before the deadline and after the deadline. There's presumably also a tone thing to this. What we have found out is that in some cases, the harsher tone gives result and the nice tone doesn't, even though we try to be nice because there's a lot of pressure on us to be really nice all the time. But when people don't pay, eventually you have to be a little bit tougher. Yeah. But so I think there's a trade-off. If you can pick your clienteles, then you can be tough on some subsets, and you can be really nice and use social norms or reminders or things like that. So maybe that's also in response to the comment earlier that you need to actually slice your population and then use very different ways of going at them. But that's just the experience.
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent, but I think the main issue with letters from the tax administration classically has been that it's too complex. We had one example when we were holding back a letter. We were going to test a new employee, newly registered self-employed. And we read on the internet that, whoops, someone is already working on this group, and we were able to hold back like a sub-sample of 2,500 letters, and then we randomized that, and we measured the effect, and there was absolutely no effect. And that was one of the more classical letters. It had 4 pages, or several pages, a lot of information, of which very little was relevant. So I think it's more about making it easy than about having different strategies. That said, though, we do combine the testing with, we had different messages in the letters, but we also have different strategies. So we do see that some people do not react to the letters, and those are typically those who were offenders last year and who haven't paid. And those, maybe, we can treat them differently. But then different tone of the letter is not going to make a difference. It's our experience. But making things easy first, that's difficult enough.
Hello, I'm Chaka from the UK Passport Office. We're actually in the process now of conducting a trial. We're trialling a passport expiry reminder service where we've actually sent out 2 different reminders. So we sent out a reminder by letter and followed up by a text message, which you've just said now doesn't work. But in our business, it's slightly different because for you guys, receiving payment later is not a problem. We actually want our customers to apply early before the peak period. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering, from your tests, why do you think the text message didn't work before the deadline?
It's kind of interesting. We didn't believe the results ourselves either, so we figured out that we need to talk to someone. And so we called a number of the recipients, and they loved it. It's so nice that you finally start sending friendly reminders, is what they said. And no one were negative, and everyone remembered having received the message, but those were probably the people who would have filed anyway. So it's just not enough. It might have been something about the timing. It's difficult to personalize. And I think that text messages, I receive several text messages every week. It might just have been overused as a channel. I don't know. It surprised us.
Shirley from Australia. I would actually say SMSs have been working significantly for us, but what we have done is we use the power of our analytical tools to identify collections of taxpayers that appear that they haven't paid in the past or had traditionally paid late. We experimented with a whole range of different texts of messages, but of the 100,000 tests that we did, we had 39% of people pay on time for the first time ever by sending it 4 days in advance, but it also brought in about $423 million for the first quarter. We then did it again for the second quarter of small businesses lodging their activity statements, which include GST, their withholding from wages and others. The second one, we sent a subset of messages where we said thank you for paying last time, but we thought that was still a high risk group because, did the SMS nudge them or not? And we continue to have a favourable impact. So over a 6-month period, we brought in about $0.9 billion on time for the first time. So there was a significant shift. So it's interesting, I was wondering whether in your SMSs then, were they broad-based or were there segmentation? Because I saw on your slide you had different categories. And in your analysis of the different categories, did you have some success or you believe that there was no impact at all?
Instead of segmentation before doing the test, we've been doing the segmentation afterwards. So we haven't found any subgroups for text messages before the deadline actually works. However, I think it's great that you have found those results. And the results we have just means that testing is necessary. Like Rohan says, it might work in one context, but not in another.
Because we actually use it for lodgement and payment. I don't have the lodgement ones with me at the moment, but I wonder whether making it easy, if it's still a complicated process and whether they need to use third parties to help them lodge. It might be the wrong nudge message at the wrong time, as you were, I think, saying.
Yeah, we did try it several times. We did not test different messages we could have. But I just think it's really interesting that you can get different results in different contexts. And it's also really interesting that once we have something on them, like they're already misbehaved, it works. And it works pretty well for a lot of people.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arne. We're now going to start our broader Q&A. Thank you for these excellent presentations, and thank you all for your participation. I'm going to kick it off by asking each one of our panelists to answer very briefly the following question. What are the behavioral insights that you think we should be adopting in the near future to keep improving in this field? And in that context, I know we have in the audience our colleagues from Australia, and I think the United States, Canada, sorry, I was just trying to read your accent. I know you cannot read mine. And we will also invite you if you have something to say on this. So what next? What are the next developments in this area? Shall we start with you, Eric?
Yeah, I think what we have learned is that looking back at behavior in the past is not really very successful. We have to look into the future, develop strategies, as we heard today, which make people think about how they will behave in the future. Fair play rules, etc., signing the contract of honesty before you fill in, etc. Thinking about how you deal, you interact in the future in a way to, well, stabilize cooperation.
I'm going to pick up the sort of a structural point related to a lot of the discussion we've just had, which is about the interaction of what we do in segmenting our populations, our data science with our populations, and how we've melded that with behavioural insights. And I see structurally these things coming together. The Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, Stefan, who's presenting probably elsewhere at this moment, maybe. That's probably his applause there. They phoned us up. They phoned me and the data exploitation, data science director in our world, and they said, we're thinking of bringing these two things together. And my answer was yes. It might not work in all organisations, but I see there being something structurally about us breaking down the boundaries. Was all of the discussions we've just had about subgroup analysis, about what works for different people, that's where it's going. We've done a lot of experiments as a group of people that show we can have an influence. It is now breaking that down and grappling with the ethics of that and understanding what's right and fair and what is best for citizens.
And I think from my perspective, I think simplification, making things easy, that's where we really have a lot of work to do. Finding the groups that really do commit errors and then figuring out why, and then having a process of figuring out from their point of view, how are their customer journey, and then figuring out how we can meet their needs, hopefully without them committing those errors. Because people stop complying when things are difficult. So, simplification.
I agree wholeheartedly with that whole customer journey approach and looking at the right outcome variables.
And it takes time.
Yeah, it takes time.
Yeah.
It's going to be a long process.
Yeah. And then Cheryl afterwards.
Thank you. I think one of the things from Canada's perspective, we're a very big organization and everybody does something, but what we need to do is disseminate the results on the one hand, but also we need to talk about the scientific method behind this, because a lot of people say I do nudge because they send letters, or I do behavioral economics because I deal with people. So I think we need to do a bit more work in that, and we think that maybe in 3 or 4 years, this is going to be part of the normal business of government generally, but I mean in our case of tax administration. And then if we look further than that, I think we deal with humans. So we need to think about this more broadly than about letters, or we need to think about how people react to what we do. We need to think about how to make it easier. And we think we make it easier, but when we talk to people, they say, well, it's not any easier. So we need to think kind of put ourselves in their shoes. If we want to make it easier, if we want to make service better, if we want to make compliance better, we can't do it alone. And maybe it's this idea of having a neighbor that looks over one of our shoulders that we heard yesterday. It's this idea that we also need to not only work between ourselves, but actually ask the customers or the clients for what really makes their life easier, because that's the idea in the end, is to make it cheaper and more efficient for all of us. So that's basically what.
Thank you.
Profit a little bit.
Cheryl? What next for Australia?
Yeah, it's interesting for us. We're part of a program of reinventing the ATO, and I think that we were building it on a culture around collaboration and co-design with the community. And I think that that's a key element, that we sometimes get excited around all of our experiments and directions and things, but we forget that there's actually a victim out there that we're affecting through our interactions. And I think that the key elements that I would be saying for us in Australia is that not only do you engage your community, but you also engage your staff, and that you ensure that, you're right, it's not about letters or SMSs or phone calls and things like that. It's actually the whole experience that a individual citizen will receive. And so it's not just about a tax either, it's about the whole of government. And I think that there's a big shift happening in Australia around looking at government services as a whole, because we're not the only one that's interacting with someone on a daily basis. And I think the next step around that is, how do we actually design government out of the lives of citizens? I think there's a risk that we get excited on how we can better influence people, but is it actually necessary for us to actually interact with somebody? And so you go back to, I think, our first principles when we first started, and why the IT unit was in the Cabinet Office. How do we actually look at our policy and design the friction out of the overarching system? So that's probably where we're going next.
Perfect, thank you. We open the floor.
Hello, my name is Catherine Priest. I work for the Better Regulation Delivery Office, which is part of Department for Business Innovation and Skills in the UK. And I work particularly with local authority regulatory services, helping them improve the way they deliver regulation to achieve compliance. And I'm particularly interested, Eric, in the work that you've been doing around power and trust, and wondered whether you saw any parallels between tax compliance and other areas of compliance such as health and safety, licensing, fire.
Yeah. Shall I answer immediately, or would you like to collect more questions? John?
Immediately. This is what we learned yesterday.
Yeah.
We have to go immediately. Huh?
And simple. Yeah, I think you can apply this framework to many, many other situations, also organizations, the behavior within organizations. In essence, it's a very simple framework. We are talking about horizontal and vertical relationships in human interaction, where the way you trust, you cooperate, you empathize with other people would be the trust dimension, and the power dimension is just the hierarchical dimension. I can imagine very well that you can apply it into business organizations and understand when people collaborate with the management and when they do not, and as well in health sectors and so on.
Professor, here. Yes. Right there. No, right there. Yeah.
Good. I was taken by the last comment, I think from Shirley, about the need to integrate with the individuals we are asking for compliance from, and to get their feedback and to get their input. And I think that should be done on more than a focus group kind of level, but in a mass way. One of the things that's being done very successfully in businesses is the idea of co-creation of their products and services. They are asking in a general way from all their customers, clients, and prospects to help us design our products and services by giving us input, giving us information that will allow us to shape the communities. And that leads to trust, and it leads to a sense of unity, a sense of loyalty and identification with that particular brand or organization. And excuse me, I think that's possible in this arena as well. We are, after all, of the same country, of the same nationality, and the sense that we are of the same place is a very unifying factor that can spur people to want to be less than self-interested and more group interested. And I saw one result that I think is just remarkable in this regard. When we ask for the feedback or information from others about what we are doing, we typically ask for their opinion or their expectation of what they will get. And it turns out that both of those are mistakes, because they ask people to be critics, to separate themselves from the entity and criticize it. It's a separation orientation. If instead we ask for their advice, one word, advice instead of opinion, now it's a merging kind of orientation that they take, and it unitizes and causes those individuals to be more likely to want to frequent that, that organization, that set of products or services. Something very simple we can do. It's another example of a nudge. One word, change opinion to advice, and you get a much greater sense of solidarity, buy-in, and loyalty. And
in the UK, just to quickly comment on that, it's a big area. I want it to be less of a disciplinary thing, sort of like a discipline-based thing. Because at the moment what I see is I talk to the head of the policy lab in the UK's Cabinet Office, and they're very much about co-creation and ethnography and various approaches, some of which we use quite a lot. We do some co-creation. But at the moment, one of the things that concerns me when I look across the world is different disciplines, user testing, UX, developing in one way, and behavioural science sometimes developing in the sort of we come in with a solution. I really don't like that, and I think the sort of ethnography and natural building hypothesis-free stuff is a big area, and it's something where I think we all have a responsibility for crashing those in. It's certainly one of my team's objectives this year to think about how the front end of what we do works, our discover work, and becoming less about desk research and bringing in levers or thinking about pre-population and big changes to the thing. And I think we're getting there, but it's a big area. I think you're entirely right to pick up on it, and it's a challenge for all of us as behavioural scientists.
And we're doing, in Norway, we actually do involve the public in creating the services to a certain extent. And one thing I didn't show here, and one thing I didn't share, was that one of the most productive things we did is we had phone numbers at the bottom of some of our letters, and Marianne is sitting there, got her whole holiday destroyed last year because the phone was ringing all the time. And we noted why the people were late. We also called a random group of about 200 people, and we categorized them for why did they, we asked them basically just two questions. Why didn't you file on time? That was the first question. The second question, may we help you? And we found out that we were self to blame for about a third of the people being late. They thought they didn't have to file because we pre-populate our forms using data. We put the data basically in the forms for them, so a lot of people don't have to file. But that does not apply to self-employed. And that was a misunderstanding that we changed this year. We changed the media campaign, and about 10 to 13,000 more people filed on time as a result. And we also changed our way of communication as a result of knowing more about what actually was the reasons for people not filing on time. We're doing it more large scale now. We're calling 5,000 people who haven't filed on time, and they will be done by tomorrow.
Thank you. We're going to have to end because this conference is great, and it's great at keeping on time. I just want to say apologies to a couple of you that have not been able to ask a question, but we will stay behind. If you delay your lunch, you will get your answer. Two comments I want to make. First, thank you all. I think this was a great session, and there was a lot of work behind this. And Lucy and Francesca Tama are here sitting in the first row, and they really deserve a recognition. Second, a little plug. In the afternoon, there's a session about behavioral science and international development. This is a little bit focused on the countries we work in at the World Bank, and there will be one presentation also in the same area. So if you have not signed up, I think you can crash in and maybe attend that session this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.